to study. Let's look at just a couple of the tests, just maybe in Chapter 2, that would kind of help us illustrate some of these points you guys are making. So in Chapter 2, it's to identify the upper motor neuron pathologies. Hoffman's reflex is on page 13. There are 4 studies that showed a utility score of 2, which again is a moderate evidence to suggest that we should use this test. But the comments share that this test is not a good screening test. Not that you guys remember everything about that test specifically or whatever, but can you just comment maybe on how we might interpret, okay, we've got a utility score of 2, yet in the comments. Chad, go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, so Hoffman's is a good choice, and primarily because it is traditionally used as a screening tool to rule out a condition. As Eric said, to rule out, you need to be around 0.1 or close to 0. And Hoffman's is not that. It's more specific than it is sensitive. So it's better actually at ruling in. What's interesting is I'm part of a systematic review right now. There are over 20 studies that have looked at Hoffman's now. And so that gives you some perspective of the growth of research in this area on diagnostic accuracy. I think the real value in that case is you get to look at the risk of bias in those particular 4 studies. And we use the QUADS score. And based on our sensitivity analyses, a QUADS of 10, because it's scored from 0 to 14, a QUADS of 10 and higher is a low risk of bias. And those particular studies tended to be closer to the truth than studies that had really high risk of bias, which would be numbers below 10. And Eric mentioned earlier that tests are either sensitive or they're specific. When one goes up, the other goes down. You occasionally would run into studies that would report high sensitivity and high specificity. And those are eye-opening tests because in most cases, those just don't happen. So what was really valuable, I think, what we decided to do with this is by reporting the risk of bias, you could easily identify those studies that reported really strong tests that were probably poorly done. And that's why they had the high risk of bias score.
Hear the entire episode for free on iTunes, Spotify, other favorite podcast players, or go to mechanicalcareforum.com.